Today's national accounts confirm the devastating impact on the Australian economy from COVID-19. Our record run of 28 consecutive years of economic growth has now officially come to an end. The cause? A once-in-a-century pandemic. The effect? A COVID-19-induced recession. Real GDP fell in the June quarter by 7%, the largest quarterly fall on record. Since the series began in 1959, this is its largest ever fall. The previous largest fall was 2% in 1974. Behind these stories and these numbers are heartbreaking stories of hardship being felt by everyday Australians as they go about their daily lives. Be it the tourism operator in Cairns, the tradie in Melbourne, the cafe worker in Adelaide, or the domestic flight attendant in Sydney. They have all been hard hit by COVID-19. Today, we are reporting these devastating numbers, but today, Australians are living them. We have done everything possible to cushion the blow for the Australian community from COVID-19. Our priority has and will continue to be saving lives and ensuring that Australia's healthcare system has the capacity to test and to trace and to treat coronavirus cases. We acted quickly and decisively to close our international borders and put in place restrictions that would suppress transmission but allow large parts of the economy to continue operating where it was safe to do so. We didn't go down the path of countries like Sweden, which put few restrictions in place. At the same time, we didn't go down the path of countries like France, which accepted and adopted extreme lockdowns, totally shutting down large parts of their economy. Instead, we chose our own path and put in place $314 billion worth of support for Australians to build a bridge to the other side of this crisis. Our strong economic position going into this crisis has given us the financial firepower to respond. Without the Morrison government's economic support, 700,000 more jobs would have been lost and the unemployment rate 5 percentage points higher than it is today. This support has enabled Australia to avoid the fate of many other nations. This crisis is like no other. The World Bank is expecting more economies to contract this year than at any time since 1870. The OECD is forecasting a contraction in the global economy this year of 6%, compared to just 0.1% at the height of the GFC in 2009. And globally, the equivalent of around 500 million full-time jobs have been lost, according to the International Labour Organisation. Indeed, Australia's economic performance sits among the top of those developed nations as a result of our health and our economic plan to fight the virus. In the United Kingdom, GDP fell by 20.4% in the June quarter. In France, GDP fell by 13.8%. Canada by 11.5%. Germany by 9.7%. And the United States by 9.1%. While New Zealand is expecting the economy to contract by more than 20%. This is in contrast to today's national accounts, which show that GDP fell by 7% in the June quarter and contracted by 0.2% in 2019-2020. These results are consistent with the Treasury forecast in the July Economic and Fiscal Update. The June quarter result was driven by the largest fall in household consumption on record, with business and dwelling investment also falling. These falls were partly offset by a contribution from net exports and moderated by unprecedented government support. Household consumption fell by 12.1% in the quarter and by 2.6% in 1920, the first annual fall in household consumption in the history of the national accounts. Household consumption fell in 10 out of the 17 consumption categories, with the largest falls seen in the consumption of services. Social distancing and travel bans saw large falls in spending on transport services and hotels, cafes and restaurants. New business investment fell by 3.5% in the quarter, driven largely by falls in machinery and equipment investment. Investment in new machinery and equipment fell by 6.8% to be 13.4% lower through the year. Elevated uncertainty, business shutdowns and social distancing requirements following the onset of the pandemic resulted in businesses preserving liquidity by deferring, cancelling and limiting equipment purchases. However, the ABS has noted that the instant asset write-off lessened the COVID-19-driven falls, as was the intent of the policy. New building investment fell by 2.3%, while engineering construction rose by 1.9%. These outcomes compare favourably with those in other countries where construction activity was much more heavily restricted. The falls in business investment were concentrated in the non-mining sector, where investment fell by 5.1% in the quarter. Mining investment rose by 1.3% in the quarter, its third consecutive quarterly rise, and recorded its first rise in financial year terms in 7 years. Dwelling investment fell by 6.8% to be 11.2% lower over the year. Both houses and other dwellings contributed to the decline this quarter, with falls across all states and territories with the exception of Tasmania. Today's result reflects the slowing in commencements and some reduced productivity on construction sites from social distancing requirements. New public final demand increased by 2% in the June quarter, driven by frontline services and COVID-19 responses to support households. This included increased expenditure on frontline employees, as well as the use of goods and services such as personal protective equipment, cleaning and logistics. Net exports contributed 1 percentage point to GDP growth in the quarter, as imports of goods and services fell more than the exports of goods and services. The health-related restrictions significantly affected our tourism and our international education industries, with services trade heavily impacted by travel bans on both inbound and outbound travel. Travel-related trade has almost ceased, resulting in sharp falls in both imports and exports. Australia recorded its largest current account surplus on record of $17.7 billion, or 3.8% of nominal GDP. This is the fifth consecutive surplus, the longest period of current account surpluses since the 1970s. Exports continue to be supported by the free trade agreements that our coalition government has entered into, which now cover around 70% of our two-way trading relationships, compared to just 26% when we first came to government. Inventories detracted 0.6 percentage points from GDP growth in the quarter, driven by retail and wholesale trade. Nominal GDP decreased by 7.6% in the June quarter, taking annual growth for 1920 to 1.7%, which is in line with Treasury's forecast of 2% in the July Economic and Fiscal Outlook. Turning to the income side, compensation of employees, which measures the national wage and salary bill, decreased by 2.5% in the quarter to be 0.4% higher through the year. The decrease in the compensation of employees was driven by a record loss in jobs over the quarter, which the JobKeeper payments helped to cushion the blow. Despite a fall in compensation of employees, household disposable income increased by 2.2% in the quarter to be 6.4% higher through the year. The increase in household income was driven by the largest increase in social assistance payments in Australia's history. Social assistance benefits rose by 42% in the quarter, contributing 4.4 percentage points to growth in household disposable income. The household savings ratio increased to a record high of 19.8% in the quarter. While policy supported household incomes, consumption fell sharply as a result of the restrictions and helped increase the savings ratio, reflecting the caution of households. As expected, there is a clear industry story in these numbers, reflecting the differential impacts that the health restrictions have had across industries. Gross value added fell in 15 of the 20 industries, with the largest falls in hospitality and tourism-related industries. Gross value added in accommodation and food services fell by 39% in the quarter, by 22.6% in arts and recreation, and by 21.5% in transport, postal and warehousing. The national accounts show that government policy particularly targeted those industries most heavily impacted by health measures. The supported business income in a very difficult period where health measures to contain the spread of the virus forced many businesses to either close their doors or operate at reduced levels. This support will be a necessary buffer against reduced activity for some time and will help businesses recover on the other side. While these numbers are extremely sobering and indeed devastating, back in May we had expected them to be even worse. In March, Treasury were contemplating a collapse of GDP of more than 20% in the June quarter. In May, Treasury was forecasting GDP to fall by over 10% in the June quarter. But with the spread of the virus being contained, on the 8th of May, National Cabinet agreed a three-step framework to achieve a COVID-safe Australia and the lifting of restrictions by July. As restrictions were gradually eased over the June quarter, the recovery began to take shape. Consumer confidence had increased for 9 consecutive weeks and has now recovered 70% of its fall. Business confidence had recovered nearly 80% of its fall. And of the 1.3 million people who either lost their job or saw their hours reduced to zero, more than half were back at work by July. This gives us confidence that as a nation we are better placed than most other nations, and that by containing the virus we can chart a pathway to economic recovery, and we can leave the worst of the economic crisis in the June quarter behind us. But the road ahead will be long. The road ahead will be hard. The road ahead will be bumpy. But it's important to recognise that this fall in the June quarter does not include the economic impact from the Stage 4 restrictions imposed by the Victorian Government in early August. This is something that will weigh heavily on the September quarter numbers. Today's devastating numbers confirm what every Australian knows, that COVID-19 has wreaked havoc on our economy and our lives like nothing we have ever experienced before. But there is hope and there is a road out. Our plan for the recovery has seen hundreds of thousands of Australians get back to work. and thousands of Australian businesses open their doors. Our commitment to the Australian people is that we have your back. We were with you on the way into this crisis. We are with you through this crisis, and we will be with you all the way out of this crisis.